Welcome Internet. Today we're going to be talking about psychotherapy for people diagnosed with schizoid personality. So before we begin, I just want to say that this is my professional opinion, but it's still an opinion nonetheless. That means that it is not a universal truth, but it's what I've seen, what I've experienced, and the insights I've gained while practicing psychotherapy with people with schizoid personalities. So, very fundamentally, what do I mean by schizoid personality? So, I'm not meaning the DSM, or not quite, right? What I mean by schizoid personality is a form of personality in which the individual struggles to be able to connect to others. They often seem uncaring or emotionlessness, in which basically they don't show their emotions. They might suffer from what is called alexithymia, i.e. emotional blindness. But that doesn't mean that they don't care. It's just that on the surface it might not be quite easy to see it for other people. They might spend a lot of time isolating, being alone, rather than being with other people. This is more the general picture, right? But Harry Guntrip, a British psychologist and psychoanalyst, define criteria that I found to be much more relevant to these personalities, often subjective criteria, which is something that the DSM often lacks. And the main criteria of Guntrip are, there's 7 of them, but basically it's a form of pseudo-arrogance in which the person might show themselves as better, but this is not because, as a narcissist would, they want to impose themselves. It is just because they are afraid of being engulfed. Therefore, they try and protect themselves by saying that they don't need others. Their arrogance is more about self-preservation than it is about domination. In another aspect, they might seem, distant. Again, fear of engulfment. They're distant because they're very afraid of others, both consciously and mostly unconsciously. And subjectively, they tend to have a rich internal life in which they animate a lot of daydreams and scenarios, very, very rich when people interact, in which they have like fantasies. It's like, basically it's like a TV show in their minds, but that TV show does not necessarily give way to real interactions, meaning everything is internal. They tend to replace the interactions with the external world with interactions with the internal world. And this is basically where psychotherapy can be very beneficial, because going to therapy and opening up to someone can be so important, because it can help them transition from a deep, rich internal world, but empty or hard to maintain external world. Psychotherapy, because of the relationship with the therapist, can help bridge that gap between the internal and the external. But it's not the only reason, because a schizoid individual often, and this is what Fairbairn, a Scottish psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, stated, is that the schizoid is fundamentally afraid of love, because during childhood they felt that their love was as destructive as hate would have been. Therefore, if they're going to destroy someone, then you might as well, if the relationship is going to destroy someone, they might as well hide that form of love from others, because they don't want that to destroy. They don't want the only hope they have left to fundamentally blow up the whole framework of the relationship. Therefore, they learn and they internalize that they cannot have relations, not without these relationships being destructive, hurtful, harmful, be it for them or for others. And this is also an important phase of psychotherapy, is that it can help them understand that love isn't destructive. And when I mean that, because you might be thinking it's obvious It's only obvious on the conscious level of the mind, but on the unconscious level, there's nothing less obvious for people who have schizoid personalities, because often they've had severe trauma, neglect, in which the parent was unable to receive their love, or unable to provide love. Or if they were able to provide some form of care, that care was hurtful. It came loaded with a lot of hatred, with a lot of disdain. Therefore, the schizoid individual learned very early on how to distance themselves, how to put a barrier between oneself and the others, in a way to dissociate, to avoid being traumatized further by interactions, by the unpredictability of humankind, because that's how the schizoid often perceives humans, other humans, as fully unpredictable, and they often tend to expect the worst from others rather than the most positive elements. And sometimes somebody can even be suspicious of the positive, that they're just an aspect, but the person will at some point fall from grace or do something that's unintended or hurtful, but not because they're evil, but because they're unable to maintain the good relationship. They're unable to give the goodness that they try and give. And I should say this because it's important, but the schizoid individual might fundamentally be on many degrees and levels. That there are some schizoids that can interact with others, that can give a facade of adaptation. Those schizoids were called by Fairbairn exhibitionistic schizoids. Schizoids that can maintain a persona in a social environment, but a lot of them, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them have issues with that or do not want to do it. Therefore, they tend to be recluse. And of course, the more the schizoid is recluse, the harder psychotherapy becomes, because it becomes a real investment beyond the money, beyond the time. It becomes a real risk to attach oneself to the therapist, because the therapist might be bad, the therapist might miss things, the therapist might be stupid. And all of that is a real risk, and it's seen as a schizoid as really sometimes too much of a risk. Therefore, they will often use a process called in and out program, how Harry Guntrip called it, but nowadays we say in and out relationships, in which fundamentally the schizoid is going to come into psychotherapy and leave when it becomes too intense, when it becomes too deep, too profound, because they're afraid that if ever the therapist basically enters the inner world, not just bridges the inner world with external world, but really enters it, that in a way they will be betrayed, they'll be afraid, therefore they leave. And I have to say, this is not like paranoia, in which the paranoid individual thinks that the others are out to get him, or that there's a conspiracy, a plot. Schizoid don't necessarily believe that, but they do believe that the other can hurt them without even knowing it, without even realizing it, that the relationship itself is a risk, and it's very, very, very risky. Very fundamentally, the relationship with a therapist is no exception. So therefore, it is important for us as therapists to accept the in and out nature of the therapy. Because we know that the schizoid individual will come for a couple of months, maybe a year, then leave. And they might leave for a couple of months, a year, 2 years, 3 years. But if they know that they can come back, it's fine. Because this is what's very interesting with people with that phenomenology, with that subjectivity, is that when they leave, they don't wipe out the psychotherapeutic process. They don't stop thinking about the therapist. Sometimes they even reminisce about, oh yes, he would have said that, or he would have told me this, or this and that and that. And in a way, the therapists sometimes become part of the inner world of the schizoid. And after a certain time, they might feel able enough to come back. And when they come back, it's very important to accept them, to not give any critique on that space, perhaps interpret it, but again, very softly, because that's the thing with the schizoid, and I think many mental health professionals don't understand this, is that even though they might seem detached, they might seem to be hyposensitive, contrary to hyper, in their inner world, once the layers are gone, they are extra sensitive, that they can be very hurt, very wounded by certain words, and they might not show it. They might show a form of detachment, even dissociation. It's not affecting them, but deep down it is breaking them. Therefore, any critique is only going to be seen not as a chance for them to deploy their aggressivity, but as a fundamental hurt, as a fundamental bruise on their self-esteem. Therefore, it has to be also very importantly, everything has to be done with a lot of subtlety with these types of people, because they might not show it, but they're very sensitive, they're very observant, and they're very, how can I say, capable of knowing when one is fundamentally dishonest or when one is being aggressive. So it's, again, very, very essential to always give them the space. Also, in the same way that it's very important sometimes to leave a bit of silence in the process of psychotherapy. Why is that? Well, fundamentally, it's for them to be able to think. Because that's also one of the issues that can happen, is that the schizoid individual can feel intruded by others if the others are too much of a presence, are too forceful, or want to ask questions. They might feel very ill at ease and start inventing something. That invention is not necessarily a lie per se, but it's something that's not accurate either. It's more like they throw something in order to get some privacy, some inner privacy. And without silence, sometimes they can go too far, or they can feel intruded. Therefore, it can hurt the psychotherapeutic alliance, because often, not always, but often they might not verbalize it to the therapist, thinking that the therapist will not understand, or that the therapist really is like that, therefore there's no reason to address it because they can't change it, kind of mentality. So therefore it takes a lot of time, and this is a long-term type of psychotherapy. I've also heard that some people say that group therapy for schizoids can be recommended. In my experience, it might work. I'm absolutely not against it, but I do think that there is an edge when it comes to individual psychotherapy, because it's already a forced form of attachment. And because, as I was saying earlier, the first attachment to the primary caregivers was hurt by a lot of issues, a lot of trauma, this psychotherapeutic space is a second chance to be able to fundamentally help the individual verbalize their needs, to in a way create a space, strangely enough, where they can become dependent upon someone, mentally and emotionally, that they can finally have a space, have a place to verbalize the emotions, to talk about them. And that schizoid dimension is so very important, because that's at the very core what Guntrip always says in his book, The Schizoid Phenomena, Object Relations and the Self, is that if we take out that barrier, underneath there is people. These people want to connect, they want to be with others. Very rare are those who have completely forfeited the chance of a human relationship. And that's exactly what therapy is. It's a chance to reconnect in a genuine way, without being afraid, without being hurt. And this connection will then help them to recreate connections with other people if they want to. Because not all schizoids want to connect in the same way, let's say, someone who's extroverted would want to connect, right? It's not about making the schizoid non-schizoid, but it's more about giving them the option that now can be an option to really connect. And when I mean connect, I don't mean like a facade, like playing a professional role like a firefighter, a policeman. I'm speaking about who they are deeply, and being able to talk and bring their emotions into the open without fearing that they will be destroyed, hurt, or bruised by others. And I also think, because one of the main ideas behind the schizoid phenomenology is that they feel empty inside. But I do think that psychotherapy helps them build a form of innerness, a form of confidence in their inner core that they might not have before. And of course, and this is important, the work is always going to involve transference on their end, even though transference might not be easily seen, or it might not be as, let's say, intense as other forms of phenomenology. It's still there. And the schizoid individual might basically have the therapist as their inner saint or their inner devil, but still invest them with a lot of force, but they won't necessarily demonstrate it. They won't talk about it. And very interestingly enough, in countertransference, because countertransference is a response to transference, sometimes, I'm not saying often, and I'm not saying that it's always, but sometimes the therapist might feel, very interestingly enough, a lot of boredom and a lot of almost tiredness in the sessions. This is not, and this is important to understand, this is not because the schizoids are boring, absolutely not, or what they're saying is uninteresting. It's because what the clinician is feeling is this disconnect, that they are themselves are presenting something that's not really them. And this is felt through the countertransference in feelings of boredom. And once it's analyzed, once you realize it as a therapist, you can then fundamentally give something to the patient, interpret the patient, your feelings to the patient in a non-brutal way of, perhaps you feel dissociated, perhaps you feel that you're not reaching to me. And often these forms of interpretations help the patient realize that yes, they were disconnected, but they didn't even realize it because of the alexithymia, because they were not aware of it, because they were too involved in the intellectualization process to see it. So very clearly, what needs to happen is that this link needs to be genuine, as I was saying, and this rekindles, when it's genuine, when it's strong, when it's good, it rekindles the schizoid, will to participate in humanity in a very fundamental way. It rehumanizes the schizoid, because throughout all the trauma, and this is something that needs to be said regardless of pathology or phenomenology or whatever, trauma is fundamentally dehumanizing. And through connection, we recreate a form of humanity. What psychotherapy does is, yes, you are human. It's a recognition of the humanity of the other and of their worthfulness, of their value, not as beings of production, but as people, as humans. And this is why it's so fundamentally important. And for the schizoid, it's step by step, moment by moment. Because what Guntrip speaks about is that if they've become like this, it's because they took refuge in an internal bunker, filled with exciting elements and fantasies and stuff like that, but still a bunker, something that protects them from the outside world, shelters them, but prevents them from living a meaningful life, or at least, and I should be more precise, when I mean meaningful, a life of connection, which often they daydream about. So it's not as if it didn't exist at all. It's often something that's a deep desire, but they don't know how to go about it. And psychotherapy is, in a way, a blueprint for them to be able to try to reconnect, to try and be there with others, and to try and love again, and be able to be loved and give that love. And here I don't want to say that this is easy, because I think that that would be an immense disservice to the nature of psychotherapy with people who have these types of subjectivities. It's a long, arduous process, one that takes years, one that there's no shortcuts about it. It's about building something solid, but something that is solid is built slowly. At least that's what I believe in terms of the human mind. That we're not meant to change from 0 to 180 in a short period of time. We're supposed to build that 0 to 180. And this is exactly what needs to be done with the schizoid individual. And the more it's built, the more they give access to an internal world, to their fantasies, to their fears, to the fear of being engulfed by the therapist. If the therapist knows too much about them, then what will prevent the therapist from hurting them? And this is why it's so important, is because when it's slow, they can take the time that they need to test the waters, to see, oh, I'm gonna say this. What will the therapist answer? Okay, that was a good answer. And then slowly, when those good answers accumulate, there's a fundamental trust in the process and in the therapist. A trust that, very interestingly enough, often tends to expand to other relationships. In a way, it gives them this sensation that if it has worked with the therapist, maybe there are good people out there. I'm, of course, simplifying, but deep down, it gives them hope. And I think that's something the schizoid have often struggled with, that there is a hope, but they have issues acting upon that hope, because there's a part of them that's so afraid, so regressed, that they can't risk it. And therapy helps them take the risk, the fundamental risk of human relation. So that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Of course, and I'm going to state this again, this is only a professional opinion. That doesn't mean that everyone with schizoid personality should go and do therapy. This is not, it's going to heal them, cure them, make them perfect. Absolutely not. This is not what I'm intending to say or even to transmit. What I'm trying to transmit is that it can be a chance. And I think that this is good enough. That it's a chance for people to be able to grow and to be able to be helped if they want to be helped. Because that's also the big point of psychotherapy, is that in my eyes, it's never meant to be prescriptive. It's never should be, you must. It is if you want to. This is important. And especially for the schizoid, it's very important to be able to be, in a way, wanting to try it. Because I also do believe that if you force psychotherapy on the schizoid individual, what I have always seen is that it results in gross failure, because the schizoid individual does not want to be there. And that's why it's so important that both parties be completely adamant about treatment and willing to try this experience together. Anyway, that's pretty much it for real this time. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, anything you want to add, feel free to do so in the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.